Hello, everybody. So I think this talk actually is really nice following the two keynotes that we had, which were excellent talks and kind of set the stage for what this will talk about. So I'm coming from this from much more of a sociological perspective of what Bitcoin and blockchains mean in our society. And the big question that I want to tackle, at least start with, first of all, is Bitcoin money? Let's show by a show of hands, raise your hand if you think Bitcoin is internet money. It's about a third of you. Let's do another show of hands. Who thinks Bitcoin was intended to be money or internet money? So a little more of you. I'm going to argue that Bitcoin was never meant to be money. We'll go take a look. So first of all, let's define what money is. How do we understand money? And the way you understand money from an economics point of view has to do largely with this medium of exchange function, the idea that it greases the wheels of the economy and lets us trade things we don't have to barter. But it turns out that barter probably never happened on a large scale in our society. There is no archaeological or historical evidence that shows that. What the real fundamental piece about being money is this socially accepted unit of account. If we don't measure things in money and price things in money, then it doesn't matter what we use to exchange because we have no prices to exchange with. It doesn't matter about store of value because we don't know how to price the value that we're storing. So really quick, is Monopoly money money? And the answer is if you're playing a game of Monopoly, it is. Because when you play a game of Monopoly, that's how we price everything in that game. And then it becomes the unit of account. And because of that, it becomes the medium of exchange within the game, and so on. So that's just how I'm thinking about money, and this is, I think, the most fruitful way to think about money. So in order to look about the future of internet money or cryptocurrency, let's look to the past. And Bitcoin's prehistory, so it didn't just start in 2009 with the Satoshi white paper. It goes all the way back to the 70s in terms of the fundamental building blocks that were needed, but also research that was aimed at cryptocurrencies in particular. So David Chaum is probably the grandfather of cryptocurrencies, and he was the first to actually use the terminology for cryptocurrencies. And his concern was that as computerization was increasing in terms of commerce and governance, that governments and corporations were able to look at our digital traces and get information about us. And he wrote this quotation in 1985, which was prescient about what ended up happening with Cambridge Analytica, for example, right? And so in 1982, he appears at this academic conference, this cryptographic conference at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and presents this paper, Blind Signatures for Untraceable Payments. This is the very first piece of archaeology, let's say, in the prehistory of Bitcoin. And in it, he's talking about using blind signatures, using public and private key pairs to create anonymous transactions using an internet or an electronic payment system between two computers. 5 years later, he comes back with co-authors, and again, we have this innovation in an academic setting talking about now how do we prevent these online payments, these online tokens from being double spend? And the answer, again, relies on cryptography. But I want to keep in mind all the way through that the unit of account or the kind of money they're talking about is always dollars, right? So they're talking about using online payments in dollars. They're American researchers. They're not thinking about disrupting any sort of system. They're talking about technical innovations to technical problems. And this double spend detection using zero-knowledge proofs is actually really interesting. I don't have time to go through it, but there's a fascinating paper called How to Explain Zero-Knowledge Protocols to Your Children from 1989. It's an excellent paper. So by the early 1990s, there was enough academic research in applied cryptography, mathematics, and computer engineering that you can have a workable digital cash system. All of these systems were centralized at the time. So they all relied on banks or mints to issue, to stamp and sign transactions, and to detect the double spend, right? Even David Chaum, when he founds DigiCash in 1989, which was the first digital currency or payment system that used cryptography, It was based on an externally granted money, an externally granted unit of account. So it was US dollars and German Deutschmarks at the time was what it would be using. Nowhere in any of this discourse were issues or properties of moneyness. They just assumed that it would be the money that we're already using. The same way when you use PayPal. That's a way of transmitting money, but it doesn't change the form of money. It changes the form, but not what the money is, okay? Then we have this whole ideological layer that's put over this technical stuff. So when the cypherpunks come along and start developing protocols and actually implementing software that takes into account these cryptographic methods, we see again that they are building out systems but don't address the fundamentalness of money. Their particular concern was about privacy. It wasn't about disrupting the system, disintermediating central banks. It wasn't about rewriting the money economy. It was about how do we have private transactions. And so some of the very first thing that they built was anonymous remailer systems. It was a way to send emails without governments or corporations snooping into your messages. They did not rewrite an email system. They used the existing protocols and built a workaround to make it anonymous. And so when they were talking about anonymous transaction systems, it was the same thing in mind. They weren't saying, let's create a new type of money. Working with our existing framework of money, how do we make anonymous transactions? Right? And so again, the idea was that David Chaum's technology or mathematics could be used to allow computers to liberate us and protect us from the computers that are spying on us, right? Nick Szabo was the first to put it all together. He's talking about basically the seeds of blockchain technology in 1998, replicated database technology to transfer ownership of property. So now we're talking about an implementation where it's not money. He's talking about property including not only land, but chattels. So land is his first idea, but also securities and monetary instruments kind of at the end. So it's kind of a general purpose technology, right? It's not a money technology, it's a general purpose technology. And how would we do it? Again, he's talking about putting together all of that academic stuff that came before from David Chaum and through the crypto conferences. And what we end up with is a system that doesn't have anything to do with money. Even when we talk about where we'll end up with the Satoshi white paper, Satoshi's innovation was bringing in proof of work to all of this and decentralizing it through proof of work. Proof of work was originally to combat junk email, so Dworkenauer, and then put into Hashcash by Adam Back. But this was never meant to be about money either. It was meant to be about preventing spam email by making it expensive to spam. And here we have the Satoshi white paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And when people see the word cash, they think money. And maybe even Satoshi intended it to be money, but that doesn't necessarily make it so. At no point in the white paper does it talk about how it would be money. It talks about the technology, talks about how proof of work will prevent double spend in a decentralized way, but there's no discussion of money or moneyness. Again, talking about proof of work, he's not talking about proof of work to make a monetary policy or monetary system. Instead, it's a way of solving this Byzantine generals problem. So again, technical problems, technical solutions, there's nothing economic or financial about any of this. As we saw in the keynote, we have this 2008, why do we get it then? Well, because we have undermined trust in our financial sector. Seems like a good place to demo this in the real world. But again, the monetary policy is pretty arbitrary, makes no economic sense. If you were to poll 100 bankers, economists, or financial guys, they would not say this is how we should have a monetary policy. So were Bitcoins ever meant to be money? Well, let's hear from what they say from the horse's mouth. Hal Finney says, it occurs to me that digital cash could be a collector's item. Hal Finney was the very first person to receive Bitcoin transaction from Satoshi and was a very early innovator in things like private public key pair, PGP cryptography. So it's going to be a collector's item, not money. What does Nick Szabo say about BitGold? It acts more like a collector's item than like gold. calls it BitGold, but it's a collector's item. What does Satoshi say? Well, in 2010, he's still active on Bitcoin Forum and Bitcoin Talk, and somebody posts a thread about, oh, Bitcoin's going to be like stocks. And he responds, no, Bitcoins have no dividend or potential future dividend, therefore not like a stock, more like a collectible or a commodity. So even the people developing this never thought of it as money the way that we think about it as money. They're thinking about it as deriving value from its relative scarcity, but in the same way that like a Mickey Mantle rookie card is scarce and valuable. So what can we think about Bitcoin and blockchains then? And the way I'm approaching it is to think now quite abstract. Let's step back from all of this. And it's a technological system, but it's also a social system. And together they are these socio-technological assemblages, right? And any blockchain, if we're thinking about it from this high level, have three fundamental features. It's a direct peer-to-peer exchange between people, so it's social. It's connecting people in a peer-to-peer way. It's a shared record of the exchange, and that's also social. We're sharing it. We all have a record of it, even if it's in computer form. And three, a way to achieve consensus in reference to the honesty of that. So it doesn't matter if we're using proof of work, proof of stake, proof of whatever, there's a consensus mechanism that keeps everything fair. But the important thing is that these assemblages can be enacted in several ways. And that means how they're put together, how they're articulated between the software and the people that are using them. And I'm going to propose three ways that we should maybe think about blockchains from a much higher perspective, higher point of view. The first, blockchains are systems of accounting, and I think this is also probably the most straightforward and the way it's being used mostly today. So what is a system of accounting? It's a way of record keeping on ledgers. And systems of accounting might not sound very glamorous, but double entry bookkeeping, when it was created in the late Middle Ages, was a very powerful force. It was such a powerful tool that it made possible this new system of social and economic production that we call capitalism. So capitalism and double entry bookkeeping are absolutely intertwined. Capitalism was propelled by the invention of double entry bookkeeping and a system of accounting. And this is first laid out in the 1920s by the sociologist and historian Zombart. And if blockchains are triple entry bookkeeping, what could that propel? What other kinds of system in our social and economic order can we see from triple entry bookkeeping? The answer is we don't know yet. They didn't know at the time when the merchants started rationalizing their business with double entry bookkeeping what that would mean. And so what can we keep in this ledger, in this system of accounting? All sorts of things, and we're probably all familiar with the different kinds of record keeping that we can have. But there's probably things we haven't even thought about yet. Now I'm going to get a little more abstract. Blockchains can be enacted as organizational forms or as organizations. So there's two kind of perspectives of organization theory that I'm going to talk about kind of from an academic standpoint. One is this idea of transaction cost economics. This is Oliver Williamson receiving the Nobel Prize in economics. Why did he win the Nobel Prize? Because he said, why do we have firms in the first place? Why don't we just have individual producers and we just have a series of contracts? And he said, well, it's too expensive to monitor and enforce these contracts because people don't have full information. People are going to be opportunists, and we don't know which ones are going to be opportunists. So why don't we just take all of these relationships of production and subsume them into a firm where we can rule by decree instead of by contract? So again, transaction cost economics says we have firms because it's too expensive to monitor and enforce contracts. But if we have smart contracts that are self-executing, that are relative, or not relatively, but absolutely inexpensive to enforce and execute, well, then we can actually decompose firms back into a pairwise matrix of contracts. So we can think of that as decomposing firms. On the other hand, we have another perspective in organization theory, a guy called Arthur Stinchcombe, who says that firms are just a nexus or a matrix or hierarchy of interrelated contracts. And we can then build organizations from the ground up using the blockchain as a substrate. And we see this with DAOs, with decentralized autonomous organizations are already kind of enacting blockchains as organizations. And then number three, blockchains as institutions. So an institution is broadly a system of established and prevalent social rules that structure human interactions and expectations that constrain and enable certain behavior. In other words, these are the rules of the game. Institutions are things like language, like religion, like the education system, like the central bank or the monetary system could be an institution. And then the institutional economist Douglas North is adding to that by saying, well, why do we have institutions in the first place? And the fact is, in economics, it's because they need to form credible commitments. If I'm going to do something with somebody else, I need to make sure that they follow through with it. So we have rules and we have laws that are institutions. But by radically disintermediating trusted third parties, replacing them with technology, with blockchain and a proof of work or proof of stake consensus mechanism, they become those very institutions, right? So blockchains are able to form these credible commitments in lieu of traditional institutions. So the rules of peer-to-peer transfers are set out and enforced by blockchains and a consensus mechanism, and therefore you can have a multitude of different configurations with different rules that people can choose. So if you don't like Bitcoin, you can fork it and make Bitcoin Cash. You don't like Bitcoin Cash, you can make forks of Bitcoin Cash. We'll see what happens with that tomorrow. The fact is that for the first time, we have a kind of free market for institutions that people can choose democratically which rule set that they want to adhere to. And I think Vitalik put this really nicely. He says that blockchains are the Lego mindstorms for building economic and social institutions. And that's a really powerful statement, because if we say that blockchains can be enacted as institutions in their own right by allowing rule sets to be adhered to or not, that people can jump from one to the other or create their own, well, then we have this question, a much larger question about blockchains and social order and governance, which was kind of the theme of the keynote. So I don't know if any of you remember Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes' book, but his idea was we have the problem of social order. Why don't people just bonk each other over the heads to get what they want? Why are we, living in harmony with each other for the most part? And the answer that Hobbes came up with was because we sacrifice some of our personal freedom and autonomy to the government. And the king, or at the time, or whatever government we have, then takes care of that order. So we can't do anything we want. We can't kill our neighbor or steal, because then we go to jail. And because of that, we have order, but that's that sacrifice we have to make. But Brett Scott brings up an important point 3 years ago. He writes, don't decentralized blockchains offer the ultimate prospect of protected property rights with clear rules, but without the political interference? This is essentially the vision of the internet techno-leviathan, a deified crypto sovereign whose rules we can contract to. The rules being contracted to are a series of algorithms and so forth. So in other words, taken to its logical extreme, blockchain systems can be implemented or enacted as a form of radical governance. And we see kind of experiments in this right now. So EOS has a constitution. The constitution in many ways is similar to the founding documents of nation states. And if you're going to be a participant, if you choose to use that institutional framework, you must digitally sign that you acknowledge the Constitution every time you transact on that network. And then I'm going to return to money in my last minute and a half. So Bitcoin is never meant to be money and maybe isn't money. Is Ether money? And I'm going to make a case that it is. But just remember the game of Monopoly. Monopoly money is money within the boundaries of the game. I would argue that Ether is money within the boundaries of the blockchain that is Ethereum. Why? Because it's used to divvy up the Ethereum virtual machine. So the EVM runs on all the nodes simultaneously if you want to run a decentralized application or a smart contract. And in order to do that, you have to bid for your space in line, for your queued up space to get that EVM to execute your code. And you bid for that using Ether in the form of gas. So gas is priced in Ether. It becomes the socially recognized unit of account within that boundary of the blockchain of Ethereum, which makes Ether money. After it's been priced in Ether, then it becomes the store of value that people hold on to these tokens because they know that they need to execute smart contracts in the future. And it also becomes the medium of exchange with which you pay the EVM to do your work. So in that respect, it is money. But if you transgress that boundary, the same way Monopoly money is no longer money when you stop playing the game, Ethereum or Ether is not money once it leaves the Ethereum blockchain. Then it must be exchanged. Thank you very much.